Well, hey there, friends. Every few years, I am drawn to revisit the Celtic Cross, which is the spread so many of us learn in our early days, and that some people love and some people are indifferent to, and some people have really, really strong feelings against. And what I thought I would do actually is share with you three different iterations of it and just use this as an opportunity to explore something that I actually don't do much anymore, which is to use a straightforward spread. And the reason I chose this one is because it is kind of the classic, classic one everyone starts with. And I think one of the reasons why I struggled initially is that it's not a very good all-purpose spread, by my estimation. In fact, I think what it does in the Waite book is create kind of a nebulous attitude about it. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at Waite's version, and then we're going to look at a version I really like, which is the Arthur Rosengarten version from his book Tarot and Psychology, which I really like. And then I'll share with you kind of the version that I've come up with over the years as well. And what I think I'll probably do, just for expediency, is just draw. I'll use the same cards for each of the versions of this. I'll use the same draw to give us a sense of how, again, specificity and context really makes something easier. So let's start with Waite. So I'm going to put Arthur aside for the moment, and I'm going to put my own version aside for the moment, and we'll start with Waite. Stay put. All right. So this is sort of the classic version. This is right from Pictorial Key, and one thing that you'll note is that he doesn't really. I'm actually going back. The ancient Celtic method of divination. He does explain what each thing is, but it's very, it's very Waitian. Now, I don't use significator cards, right? But in this version, you would theoretically, but then you would put the first card over it. So in none of these will I actually use the significator. And one of the reasons why is that if it shows up, if you do work with significators and it shows up in the reading, that to me is an interesting thing, rather than taking it out of the deck. So let's talk through kind of exactly as he does, how to read through it. All right. So I'm just gonna say, let's just do a fake story here. And we'll say, usually I do work-related stuff, don't I? Let's do something a little bit different this time. Well, Arthur Rosengarten's version is about marriage in his book, so let's use that as an example. So this is a person who wants to know, a predictive reading, is there marriage in my future? We'll say it's a young man in his 20s, and he's started seeing someone, and he's wondering if that relationship will end up in marriage. All right. So let me just shuffle. I don't recall how well shuffled this deck is, so it's pretty well shuffled. I always tend to shuffle for fake readings as much as I'm doing it for real readings. All right. So if this were a real reading, we'd cut the cards, and then we would have our significator, and then what Waite says the first card represents is this covers you, is his way of saying it. So this is the influence which is affecting the person or matter. All right, so we would put down that first card, and we've got Judgment. The second card goes across. Now, I did not use any reversals in this deck, right? So we've got the Three of Pentacles, and that crosses him, and that's an obstacle. The third card crowns him, and that represents the card's aim or ideal, or the best that can be achieved under the circumstances. Now, this is where things start to get really, wonky for us with Waite, right? Is that he starts saying things like, this is this or this. All right. So the fourth card goes below, and that's the foundation or basis. The fifth card goes on the side. Now, theoretically, you're supposed to put it where the querent is looking with the significator, but we don't have a significator, so we'll just use the fifth card here. And that would be what's behind this person. And then this is what's in front of them. This is what's coming into action and will operate in the near future. And then we start building the row on the side. So we go to the seventh card, and that signifies the significator, whether this person, what does he say? It signifies himself, that is the significator, whether the person or thing, and shows its position or attitude in the circumstances. Again, a little nebulous, right? 8 signifies his environment. 9, his hopes and fears. One of the more confusing for a lot of people. To move these down. Can I get the 10th card to fit? And this is the final result or outcome. We can more or less see all of those. All right, so here's our standard Waite Smith or Edward Waite Celtic Cross situation, right? So we would read as follows. So the first card represents the situation, right? This is the influence, rather, the card that influences the person and the matter of inquiry. So judgment. So I would say in this case that the situation that's influencing him most right now is judgment, is that he is actually waking up to his real expectations and feelings. He's young, he's probably had some, non-serious relationships, but he's suddenly sort of waking up to the potential of adulthood. 2 is what crosses him, that's what's in his way, it's what blocks him, it's the 3 of Pentacles. And I would say in this case, I'm going to work a little bit more numerologically than with the Waite-Smith imagery here, but I would say actually in this case, he's still fairly early in his career, his life is just getting started, so while he's waking up to possibility, he's also reckoning with the fact that he's probably not in a place yet where he's ready to, support a family, for example. The third card above is what the aim or ideal is in the matter, or the best that can be achieved. So here's where things get tricky, right? Because we have 2 options. It's the best that can be achieved, or it's the aim or ideal. Now, with the Knight of Swords, I think this ties into, I would say probably his aim or ideal right now, because as a court card, it's representing sort of an aspect of himself. As a knight, if this were his significator, that would be interesting, but we didn't choose one beforehand, right? So that would be, but I still think it would represent him, and, I think he's willing to, he wants to go and strike out and explore and learn about the world. So it's, again, getting some interesting information about this person and their relationship. Waking up to the possibility, but not, with this combination of 2 cards, we're not getting a sense yet of him being quite ready. He definitely seems to want to strike out. Now, the foundation, which is the 4th card, is the foundation or basis of the matter. It says in Waite, essentially, it shows the foundation or basis of the matter, that which has already passed into actuality and which the significator has made his own. Now with the Lovers here, which is what we've got in that position, that's a pretty strong thing for a relationship reading, for a marriage reading. So while this is all true, the thing that's also true is that he's fallen in love. So in this case, I'm going to read the Lovers card very literally. So what's good about this is that it gives us a sense of a painting of who this person is. And that is interesting to me. Now, are we close to answering the question? No, because none of the things so far are really giving us the answer that we're looking for. What will get to the answer that we're looking for is really theoretically in position 10. So in a weird way, we're going through all of this in order to get to that 10th position, which is the one that really answers the question. Now, for an impatient person, they may just say, we'll get to it. But this is an interesting thing because it's painting a picture of sort of why... And why I think that the Celtic Cross can be valuable is if you look at this as sort of an explanation of, or really everything as an explanation of why number 10 comes into play. All right, so we know that he's in love, but he's also sort of trying to strike out on his own. He's sort of waking up. We have two major cards here, Judgment and the Lovers. He's sort of waking up to the idea of his world of love, but he's also sort of at the beginning of his journey, at the beginning of his career. So we look at the 5th card, which is what's behind him, and that's the influence that has just passed. So this is the 6 of Wands. It seems like he's had some really good, career things happening in the past. He may have graduated from school recently. He may have found a job or started out and had some initial successes. So he's feeling sort of he's feeling his oats in a way. He's feeling kind of high on the hog, as it were. And then the 6th card is what's before him, and that's what's coming into action and will operate in the near future. So we get the Star. Now, a lot of people associate the Star with hope. I have a... let me use this glare here. Let me move it so you can see it a little bit better. I associate the Star with direction. So what's happening with all of this, and this seems very clearly justified in the cards before it, is that he's really kind of setting his course, and this definitely ties into the Knight up there, the Knight of Swords. So he's setting his course, he's setting his direction. What's going to be important to him is in the coming weeks and months, maybe even longer than that, is sort of where he's headed in his life. So as a young person getting ready to strike out, his sense of direction is really going to be where his energy is focused. So then we get into the 7th card, and the 7th card is the first one on the bottom here, and that represents himself, his attitude towards the circumstances. Now here we have the 5 of Cups. So here we get a sense that psychologically is really interesting. We have like he's falling in love, he's young, he's ready to strike out on his own, but his view of himself is actually pretty negative, that he doesn't actually have much to offer in a relationship, that he's the problem in his relationships. 5s are very disruptive, very full of conflict. There may be a sense of sort of feeling like he doesn't deserve it, interestingly. And then we go to his environment, his house, essentially. We have the 4 of Wands. Now, this, in the Waite Smith tradition, would be a very positive relationship card. From a more numerological system, what his environment really is about stabilizing his career. But if we do take the picture into account, it seems like there's room for another person in this house, as it were. You know what I mean? We've got 2 people here. So while his environment is really about setting himself up for his future and creating a foundation on which he's going to build his career, there's room for another person in there. His hopes and fears, the 7 of Pentacles. Interestingly, I think that he both hopes for and fears that he will be able to sort of reap the benefits of the work that he's doing, but that he'll wind up by himself in it. And that he'll wind up in a situation where he will look back and say, oh, I really gave up a lot to get here. Then the final outcome is the King of Wands. And so we get another aspect of himself, going, in essence, from a knight to a king. And as a final outcome, court cards in this position are always difficult for people. You know, if the final result is a court card, sort of what does that say as an answer to the question of, like, what's the final outcome? The final outcome is that he'll probably be relatively successful in his career. Does that answer the question that he asked, though. You know what I mean? And here's where a lot of people fall down with the Celtic Cross, is that they'll say, well, you'll be very successful in your career. Now, that's not the answer to the question he asked, which is, will this relationship result in marriage? There are two ways to go about this. One is to say, this reading is not about marriage, you're really more focused on your career. And to a degree, I would say that his primary focus is his career right now. But that doesn't answer the question that he asked, and I'm a believer in answering the question that people asked. So in this case, I have to make that card give me an answer to the question that he asked. And so I have to sort of wrestle with that, but that's actually where all of this actually can help us, right? And we forget sometimes, we go through piece by piece, we did all this work over here, we did all this work down here, we get to the final outcome question, and we'll often find an answer that has nothing to do with the question that was asked. But we have all of this to help us make that final outcome make sense. And is that no, right now this relationship is not heading toward marriage. It doesn't necessarily look like it's ending anytime soon. But he does have some things he has to deal with in terms of his own expectations and his views in the relationship. And by and large, he seems to be primarily focused on the results of his career, setting his direction, setting his path. There isn't an absence of love, right? But it's where things are headed right now are really sort of becoming the master of his own vocation. Now, here's the tricky thing about this as a predictive spread. We didn't really define a time period. And that's one of the risks, and I think another reason why people fall down when they use this. The answer to the question, as far as I see it, is no. It's not heading toward marriage, but it's not heading toward marriage yet. There are signs in the reading that marriage, or at least the success of this relationship, are possible. Certainly with the Lovers and the Four of Wands in their two positions. It does not look like the relationship is over, but it looks like his focus is elsewhere. So I think that that's an important thing to explore when doing the Celtic Cross, at least the Waite version of it, the version that Arthur Edward Waite put in the pictorial key. That use everything that came before to build the foundation to make that final card make sense. And if you do that, it often will help you feel more confident. And this actually falls into a thing I talk about a lot in my videos, which is sort of finding evidence for your answer. So while this is kind of a weird reading or a weird spread for a lot of questions, what I think this spread does well is it gives you a lot of research you can use to support your final answer, as long as you're willing to do that. But again, where I think a lot of people fall down is they interpret each card individually, and then they get to that final card about what's the outcome, and it's really confusing because we went through all of this effort, and the question is, will I get married? And the answer is no. You know what I mean? It's also, by the way, really hard for me not to look at that King of Wands and see someone who's principally interested in sex at the moment, just because of the the position of that card. I mean, it looks like a guy with a giant boner, right? That's hard to not see now that I see it. But, where the Celtic Cross can be really successful is that if the 9 cards that precede the 10th are used to support the answer and give us a sense of how the reading, or how we get to that final answer, I think that that's a success. I've never been a big fan of Waite, to be honest, other than that he instigated the Rider-Waite-Smith deck, which we all know and love. Or we all know anyway, not everyone loves it. But even though I don't use it much, I love it. But I think the way he describes it in his book is a little bit nebulous. And there are better, described versions of it out there. I think Benabel Wen does a good job. But let's look at a different version of this. So this is, again, Arthur Rosengarten's version from his book, Tarot and Psychology. And he sets us up with different positional meanings. So where, let me just actually show you. I'll zoom in on this so you can see it a little bit better before we go in and describe it. So where he sort of differs is that he starts out a lot the same way. So the first position is the situation, and then the second is the resistance or the blockage. Then he goes into, the way he lays this out is a little bit different. The cause and the effect. So these two cards would be cause and effect of this current situation. The top card is goal, and the bottom is foundation, so that's not all that different. At the base of the sorry, I'm pointing to things you can't see. At the base of the column is ego, and then object. And what is the object? Is the one, he does describe this really well. Object, how others see us. So ego is how we see ourselves. Object is how others see us. What we're anticipating is card 9. I keep pointing at the wrong thing. And then outcome. He also has another card we'll draw just for the sake of using his version, which is the gifts and guide card at the top here. So I just drew one to add to the equation. So let's reinterpret with his variation. All right. So his variation again begins with the situation. Now, this question, as I said, is a marriage question. In his book, it's not will we get married, it's should we get married. But since we started with will we get married, let's continue just sort of working through trying to answer the same question, but with his positional meanings, right? So first card, situation. So very similar because it's describing the situation. So again, we have an awakening moment for him. That's judgment. He's waking up to the world. And the block, or the obstacle, is the Three of Pentacles again. So I think these two cards I would interpret really really similarly to what we already did, right? Like he's waking up to the world. He's waking up to marriage and feelings and adulthood. By the same token, he's very early in his career, and those things are just starting. In a way, he's sort of still an apprentice to life. So his goal would be the top card. So this is different from Waite because that represents the best that can be expected, or his aims. So in that way, again, we have a very similar. So he just takes the best that can be expected out of the equation and he makes it his goal. So as the Knight of Swords here, his goal is to like get out there in the world and learn everything he can. Foundation is the same, so we would interpret that card very much the same way. Now, where things really get divergent is with these two cards. So these two cards in Waite would be the past and the future. So what has happened, what's coming into being. Past is, what he does is cause and effect. So cause is the thing that sort of got us here. And effect is the result of that. So in this case, this isn't having had a success. He has been successful to this point, and he's feeling really good about his prospects. And the effect of that is he's feeling really idealistic about where he's headed. So again, we're not getting a hugely different point of view here, but it is really interesting to see these cards in context to one another. And I think that's one thing the spread does really nicely, is it sort of brings this cluster together. Now here, this is how he sees himself, and this is how other people see him. That's really interesting. So he sees himself as sort of unlucky in love, while other people see him as really kind of stable and on his game, and they see that he's really happy in his relationship. He feels like he's not good at it. Now, this represents what he's anticipating, what he's thinking is going to happen. And so in that case, he's actually anticipating that he's going to wind up alone because he's really focused on work, and ultimately he does. And so in that case, we get the outcome. And then the gift or the guide here is the Hermit, which again is a very solitary card. So I would read this sort of differently. Will I get married right now, or is this relationship headed toward marriage? The answer for me is still no. but the reasons are a little bit differently, so I get a little bit more of a psychological portrait of him than I did in the previous version. Is he going to get married? No, not yet, in part because he doesn't see himself as very good at it, and in second because he's expecting it to fail. He's expecting his focus on work to make him alone, and in fact, he probably needs to be unattached in order to sort of reach what is his ultimate goal, right? So, slightly different picture. In this case, in the previous case, I didn't really see the relationship ending. In this case, I might view the relationship as kind of an obstacle to him. Now, of course, this is just a slight variation on a theme. But again, I think what's important in using the spread is you get a narrative of who this person is, in essence, and their situation, and you use it to support that final card, that final outcome. One of the reasons why I don't like using this spread as a predictive one is that I don't necessarily think one card is enough often. Like, if you think about the fact that we had 9 cards to describe where we are, we only have 1 card to end it. So what I might do, is actually pull 3 cards for the 10th position, to get a better picture of it. Now, I also have my own version that I've used over the years. Again, I don't use it super a lot, and it's not all that different from either of these. Where my version differs is in the flanking cards here represent past influences and present influences. So these are just things that are at play right now that are influencing the situation. And then this represents what's in my control, or the person I'm reading for, and what's out of their control. The other thing that I've changed is this card represents someone's attitude. So similar to Arthur Rosengarten's, instead of ego, it's the way that they position themselves. It's their view of the situation. It's their view of things. So how that would differ a little bit. The situation stays the same. The past influences and the present influences are really just semantic. You know what I mean? They still kind of say the same thing. And believe it or not, I actually prefer Arthur Rosengarten's version of this. Because I like the cause and effect better. But this is what's happened in the past, this is what's happening now, and that's how these are affecting the situations. So the meanings don't change. What does dramatically change, though, is the top and the bottom cards, because this is what's in his control, and this is what's out of his control. And in essence, there's a lot of way to read these, but what would change ultimately is that what's in his control is what he's going and thinking about, what he's going out and doing, what he's pursuing. What he can't control are his feelings and the choices, that are in front of him. The only other major difference is attitude, but again, as you've seen in each of the versions, his own perception of himself shows up in this card regardless of what you call it. The rest of the cards really are the same, and I don't use this position, which Arthur Rosengarten does. There are many, and part of the reason why I'm doing this is just to show that there are many, many, many variations on this theme. But like any spread, I think the Celtic Cross is as valuable as you allow it to be, and as valuable as the effort you put into it, and what you do with it. And one of the reasons why I've often sort of scoffed at the Celtic Cross is, in my younger days, is that you have to do all of this work to get to card 10, when card 10 answers most of the time the question that you want. But what I never realized up until a few years ago, honestly, was that it's all of the things that come before it that tell you how to answer that card, and that tell you why that card's there. But I do, I do prefer to have more information on a final outcome card, just sort of randomly. If I were to have 3 cards there, it would just give me a better picture. And in essence, I really could see having 3 cards for each position, because I really, that's a Robert M. Place thing, but I really appreciate having more information for each position. So in this case, the final outcome would be very, very different, you know what I mean? So it would look in this case like the relationship doesn't work out, you know what I mean? In part because he's so focused on his anxieties about the relationship that he winds up alone. Through those anxieties, he focuses on work, and ultimately ends up sort of alone emotionally. There's a very solitary quality to those three. And you know what I mean? And again, I'm doing this very fast, and this isn't real, but you know what I mean? Like, I still get more information. You know, I just like to have more cards rather than less in a spread. So I could see, you know, I mean, I could see doing 3 for each of these. You know what I mean? How he sees himself as kind of a singular, you know, mind who isn't very good at relationships, hasn't been very treated well with that by them, and kind of resists the formality, that's the Hierophant there, the formal structure of relationships. But people see him as kind of a slightly immature but creatively stable, standoffish person. You know what I mean? What are his, like, you get so much more of a picture with multiple cards. It's crazy. You know what I mean? So to have 3 for each position would take a huge amount of space and would be very difficult here, but I'm just such a fan of using 3 cards per position in a spread that I think, you know, why not do it? So this would take a whole table to make work, but I think it could be really cool. So anyway, this is just revisiting the Celtic Cross and some different variations on it. Again, there are many, many. The version that I showed you, that's my version, was really just basically what happened was early in my reading life, I found Waite's version confusing, and so I tried to clarify it for myself, and this is what I did. Initially I had a much more Waite exploration of the top and bottom cards, but one of the things that also happened over time in my reading, and again, I really don't use this very much at all. I can't remember the last time I did it. I think the last time I did a Celtic Cross spread was actually for this channel a couple years ago. But over time, I realized that there's some value in exploring and reading what's in our control and what's out of our control when it comes to a situation. And so instead of having foundation and aim, I changed this to in our control and out of our control. So that was really my big contribution to this, which I do like, you know what I mean, especially if we're looking at things from a more choice-centered point of view. But yeah, so that's my thoughts and variations. I think of the 3, Arthur Rosengarten's is definitely my favorite. I think it's the most successful. If you haven't checked out this book, it's really good. He was at the Reader Studio last year, I think, during the psychology conference, which I was not there for. I know that there's a newer book by someone else that's sort of very popular. I think it's called Tower at the Crossroads. But this is really good, and actually one of the things that I liked about this book was that the books that he refers to also were really interesting. I think, you know, there's a book called The Inner Guide Meditation that I read as a result. There was a couple others that I read as a result of this. So I like that book a lot, especially if you're interested in psychology. So yeah, just a little afternoon thoughts on the Celtic Cross and some demos of doing it, and some inadvertent tips on, you know, especially if you're starting out, some things you can do to make the Celtic Cross make more sense if you're interested in it. But I think the principal takeaway here is that whatever you do, use the 9 cards to explore how the 10th card got where it gets, you know, and that's to me the real value of any reading, especially any predictive reading, because it allows us to see where we're going and how we're getting there, and then we can make adjustments, because this guy could, in theory, decide the relationship is important, he really needs to deal with this perception of himself, and maybe he needs to focus on his career less if the relationship is really the important, for example, really that important. So, anywho, as always, I hope you're well, and have a good weekend.